Thank you all for attending. As you already know from the news, there have been some developments in Ukraine, very worrisome. It's not a threat anymore. We are really under attack as Europe, as a collection of democratic states in the world. And I think it's very urgent to talk about this, in particular about Putin, what his game plan is and how we could counter it. This behavior is not new. We know this from Transnistria in 1992. There was a Transnistria war in Moldova, and still it's a frozen conflict. A strip of land of Moldova is well, basically occupied and declared as an independent republic. And in 2008, we had South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, which was invaded basically by Russian forces, and now so-called independent republics. And then, of course, Crimea and the Donbass. And the premise is always the same. We need to protect the Russian citizens, and in that way declare independent republics and basically annex them to the new Russian Empire, as we could regard it as. That's probably what Putin is aiming for. Either a circle of neutral states around Russia, or well, neutral in regards to NATO, or just puppet states, I guess. So what are your thoughts about this? What are Putin's plans, and how can we counter them?
Okay, thank you, Ben. I think we could be talking about what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, but I don't think we can compete with the major networks, TV networks, swarming Ukraine and Moscow at the moment, trying to say what's going on, because it's changing every minute. There are bombings, there are tanks running purposely over cars with people inside. I mean, it's not just the common what happens during any war. There's all the usual nastiness by the occasional enterprising soldier. What I'd like to talk about is why Putin would want even to attack Ukraine. Why would he be bothered about it? I mean, frankly, it's not as if Ukraine is needed for its oil or gas, of which Putin has plenty. And I'm talking about Putin, not about Russia, because it's Putin's coterie we are dealing with, not all over Russia, because many Russians don't share his ideas and his doings. And so let's have a look. I've prepared a few quotes of some interesting, in my view, statements or writing by people who know the subject. First of all, we're dealing with the Gerasimov doctrine, which is the General Gerasimov, who published an article in 2013, which sort of explained what the new methods of the Russian army are. And perhaps the essence of Gerasimov's doctrine is modern warfare consists in hacking an enemy's society when attacking it head-on. He wrote, the very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases, they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness. All this is supplemented by military means of a concealed character. And we've seen this in action in the UK in 2016 with the Brexit campaign, in 2016 as well with the US election, and in many other cases in Ukraine, etc. So it's not just theory, we are putting in practice and very effectively. The approach is guerrilla and waged on all fronts with a range of actors and tools, for example, hackers, media, businessmen, leaks, and fake news, as well as conventional and asymmetric military means, which means asymmetric military means is the little green man which invaded Crimea in 2014, and then it turned up, and in the end it was Soviet troops or Russian troops, sorry, I get confused, but there's not much difference. They were actually Russians, but hey, they pretended they weren't, and the aim is to create confusion. Thanks to the internet and social media, the kind of operations Soviet PSYOPs teams once could only fantasize about, appending the domestic affairs of nations with information alone, are now entirely plausible. And you've seen it time and time again. It's pretty obvious, although it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what and when, so it's entirely deniable. It's also extremely cheap. A tank costs a lot of money, a plane infinitely more, but hey, PSYOPs and internet trolls cost very little, a few $100s a month at the Russian wages. In Ukraine, Russia has been deployed the Gerasimov doctrine for the past several years. And we look at the 2014 protests, where the Kremlin supported the extremists on both sides of the fight, the pro-Russians and the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists, fueling conflict, but then the Kremlin uses a pretext to seize Crimea. And with information warfare and this confusing environment in which nobody really knows what's going on and what are the motives, and this is what allows the Kremlin to exert control, and that's the Gerasimov doctrine in the field. The United States, the largest target, as we've seen it. A key element is that the Russians know they can't compete head-on with the West in general, US in particular. When you look at the military figures, at which we'll look later, it's staggering, the difference in expenditure and capability, manpower, planes, billions of dollars to spend. The technology is not comparable, but still the Russians manage incredibly well with the budgets and the manpower they have. So why does it work? So we create new battlefields. We are not aiming to become stronger than us, but to weaken us until we are equivalent. And that has happened, for instance, with the anti-vaccine disinformation, with what's been going on with the US election 2016, 2020, et cetera, et cetera. And the Kremlin isn't picking a winner, it's weakening the enemy. And the real power of the Gerasimov-style shadow war, it's hard to muster resistance to an enemy you cannot see or aren't even sure is there. So this is the essence of the Gerasimov doctrine. And you've seen it, and again, in action. Now, something that is very strange to normal people is why would somebody even risk going to war? In the end, Russia is making very good money with gas and oil without working too hard at it. Income from oil and gas is easy to get. Prices are very good at the moment. Why bother? Anne Applebaum, who's an expert in Eastern European matters and Russia and Ukraine, her take on the issue is it's a long way from Donbass to France or the Netherlands, where far-right politicians hang around the European Parliament and take Russian money to go on fact-finding missions to Crimea. it's a longer way still to the small American towns where back in 2016, voters eagerly clicked on pro-Trump Facebook posts written in St. Petersburg. But they're part of the same story, their ideological answer to the trauma that Putin and his generation of KGB officers experienced in 1989 when East Germany suddenly freed itself of the Soviet Union, and the likes of Putin were left unemployed and in danger as a former KGB officer or current KGB officer, burning frantically documents. Instead of democracy, they promote autocracy. Instead of unity, they try to constantly create division, and we see it all the time. Instead of open societies, they promote xenophobia. Instead of letting people hope for something better, they promote nihilism and cynicism. And again, we see it as all the time, particularly on the social networks and particularly on Facebook, the extremely negative takes, the offensive language, the races, the attacks, to divert discussion from anything substantial and to bring it to what everybody's fighting with everybody else. And every time we pick a fight of the internet, well, we're doing the troll's job. So we may want to think about it. My personal choice is to block them, and discussion is closed. Shrink somewhat their reach and shrink somewhat their capability to cause trouble. And now let's look at what I said earlier, at the figures, which are the staggering difference between the US military expenditure, second China, US $778 billion a year, China $252 billion a year, India, and then fourth, Russia at $61.7 billion a year. Just the weak divided EU and UK, we spend $140.9 billion a year, more than double what Russia spends, and we get blackmailed and painted in a corner by, in the end, a very medium player like Russia. Why can we, how does it happen? Apart from the fact that they had lots of nuclear power, but is it the mad dog principle? Is it the fact that he's ready to use the nuclear power, which UK and France are not? Why is it? Can we try to understand it? And let's say in terms of manpower, Italy has 248,000 men under arms, France 204, etc. Again, the figures are considerable even for Europe. And a comparison of the military capabilities of NATO and Russia as of 2022, we see that the total military personnel of NATO, which means including the US, is 5,400,000 men. Russia, 1,350,000 men. Active soldiers, etc., reserve, air force, etc. The figures, the difference is staggering. So why are they getting away with what we are getting away with? Just looking at the planes, towed artillery and everything, towed artillery actually, the Russians have superiority. So when we look at all these figures, when we look at all these at what goes on, the question comes up, how can we be so weak when we are so strong? So I see Danny wants to speak.
What I believe is we have to go partly back to history, and that's a long way back. That's 70 years ago in Germany. It happened in Germany when Hitler came up. he uses the same principles, in fact, as Putin doing now. And he took every country step by step. And it is what Putin also wants to do. And in this case, Putin is taking Ukraine because it is in fact a wealthy country. And it means not financially, but in things what they have in the bottom, like nuclear things, gases, oil. They all have that because, and he is interested in that. That's why he's interested in to take that country. That's the point. I made a message. I made a presentation about it. I will send that after the meeting all to you, and just look at what you think about it. But what happened? No, now what happens in those 70 years ago? Step by step, Hitler was taking every country for his, because he wanted to control. He wanted to control the world, inclusive Russia. There was they had the treaty. They made a treaty. Hitler and Stalin made a treaty to each other, a non-attack treaty, but they didn't follow that rules. They didn't follow the same path. In fact, that's what happened. So that's the reason why it came to a conflict between Russia with Stalin and Germany. So this is one point of it. I don't know what is your opinion about it. What I'm trying to explain.
Anybody else want to speak? Federico, yes.
Okay, so I don't know why. I mean, the West and NATO feels like it's so weak despite being so strong. But I think there is a reason why Russia is stronger now than it was 10 years ago, and I think the reason is China. So the alliance with China and the possibility for Russia to avoid sanctions by exporting to China, I think that's a big reason why Putin was bold enough to invade Ukraine, I think, or at least to launch a large-scale invasion and not just keeping the two so-called separatist republics and not launching a full-scale invasion. I don't know what you think about this, but okay, I think that's a good part of the problem.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point of view. So it's for you, it's China. Danny, Russia is a rich country. Federico is China. Any other opinions?
I think we have to look at pathological reasons for this behavior, because you talk about the Gerasimov doctrine and wanting democracy to fail and to create division. But I think there's something more to it. It is negative, but it is also positive in the sense that Putin sees himself as a man of destiny, as someone who has history in his hands. And I think that is a characteristic we often find with despots. And I think unless we can address that, we won't understand his motivation.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So for you, it's pathology. Very good. Who's next?
Yeah, I'll just try to answer the question about why Russia seems strong and we are weak when you compare the resources. And I guess the thing is, NATO is not in war because we decided not to take Ukraine into NATO. I guess we have, even though it's nuclear war is not going to happen, I guess we really would have troubles kicking Russia out militarily because we would risk a nuclear war, for one thing. The other thing is, if we were prepared to defend Ukraine, what we should have done was put troops in there, and that means taking them into NATO. And I think this thing that they couldn't hold the whole territory, it could have been worked around. it's much harder to get Russia out now militarily than having prevented it from the beginning. You can just see the difference between Estonia, or maybe more Lithuania now, and the Ukraine is that Lithuania is a member of NATO and of the EU. So I think we didn't have the willingness there. And one thing is whether we would come and defend the Ukraine. It's also about giving them weapons. And I think here we have to look both at the US and at ourselves. President Obama decided not to give weapons to the Ukraine with basically the same reason as Germany is now using for not letting weapons pass Germany, namely that if you give weapons to somebody, then you escalate war. But the thing is, if the Ukraine had more firepower, Putin would have been less likely to attack. Obama held that belief that we shouldn't arm the Ukrainians. Trump armed somewhat, especially if he could get some dirt on Hunter Biden, but there was no big armament. And the thing is, why should it always be the US, even if US failed? What in Europe? Why didn't we send more weapons to the Ukrainians? There are many Ukrainian soldiers that are ready to fight and risk their lives for the war. Why didn't we give them the best weapons we could? I can't believe it, and I think we have failed massively.
Yep, that's a very interesting point that we blame Obama, but Obama, that was 5 years ago. We've had time to correct it many times over. Yes, we had the time to provide weapons to Ukraine if only we wanted for 1 minute to do it. Thank you, Anders. Anybody else?
Teresa wrote, I think Brussels is not going to be taken seriously until it has its own European army. Putin doesn't care about sanctions, as we can see. Maybe more than a sanction would be if the Nord Stream 1 and 2 will be bombed or destroyed.
We need our own army, and we need to get rid of Nord Stream 1 and 2. Well, there's not just Nord Stream 1 and 2. There are lots of pipelines. When you look at the maps of pipelines coming from Russia through Turkey and through other places, there are lots of pipelines. So it's not just Nord Stream 1 and 2. And you may have a bit of opposition, first of all, in Germany, which relies heavily on Russian gas, but also Italy and France and other countries which rely nearly 100% on Russian gas, which is a grievous mistake. But okay, so that's an interesting one. All right, anybody else? Lorna Bates, I see here another message which I can't see. Just a second, because my screen is not big enough to take all these chats. Do we need
our own army?
So go ahead.
In addition to NATO.
Very good question. Yes. Does anybody want to reply to that? Ben, as we've been discussing this earlier.
Yes, I think Europe would do well if we had a lot of coordination instead of division, and we could pool our resources. So it would be we could spend more on actual equipment and personnel, and cut on administrative costs if we would have a collective army, or at least a defense union. And it's not mutually exclusive to NATO. It's within the framework of NATO, possibly.
That's a very good point. I think that what is staggering is how much more money we spend on Russia, and how and what do we get for it, in terms of readiness, in terms of quality of weaponry. The technology we have at our disposal and the manpower we have at our disposal somehow is completely wasted, because each single country must have its own defense policy, its procurement system. Okay, we do share some things through NATO or through agreements or buying, let's say, like Airbus and others, but in the end, there's a lot of wastage and duplication and money not well spent. If it was well invested, does it take a dictator to spend money slightly more intelligently, what we are doing in the EU? But above all, what is missing is not just the hardware or the cash. What we miss is the political will. Anders.
Yeah, I think I'm in favor of an EU army, or or let's say military also, to have some marines and planes. I think it's a good idea, but I don't think it automatically would have given the will to defend Ukraine. If we should have defended Ukraine, we should have put troops in there before. And I don't see any reason. I mean, there were 10, 15, 20 European countries that participated in the war against Saddam Hussein. So 10, 15 European countries, if we had placed soldiers in the Ukraine, it didn't need to be a combined army necessarily in order to work. I'm not sure we can say that if we had an army, we would also have had the will to protect the Ukraine. It's a nice thought to have the army, but I'm not sure that would have made the difference. Would we have deployed it to the Ukraine? That is the question.
Okay, that's a very good point. As I just said earlier, what really matters, the political will to use the means we have, even if we did give ourselves an army, how do we use it? It's very well having 5 million men under arms. If we are not capable of sending them where they're needed, like at the moment in Ukraine, it's again a waste of time and money. And we are weak. And this weakness, rogues are taking advantage of it. Very interesting reference to the Iraq War. Well, Iraq War 1 or Iraq War 2, because Iraq War 1 was a huge success. Iraq War 2 was initial success and then a complete disaster, but that's a different discussion.
The war itself was certainly a success, and I think there were 15, 20 European countries in it. But yes, there are other discussions about that war.
Yeah, that's another chapter, which will be very interesting, because I have some very personal elements on that. Okay, anybody else?
Okay, so there is also the fact that NATO cannot act in some areas of the world, and the European army could, for example, in the Pacific area, in case of a conflict with Taiwan, on Taiwan, for example. So that in theory, couldn't act there for NATO, let's say, rules. They cannot intervene in other areas of the world. Of course, the main threat for Europe is Russia at the moment. But yeah, in the future, China could be also. I know I always talk about China, but
China is a huge problem. And if I was Putin, I would be far more worried about China than about NATO. But that's again another discussion.
I would also say that if NATO got involved in Ukraine, especially if United States got involved, that would have been the perfect opportunity for China to try invade Taiwan, because United States cannot fight on two continents at the same time. Probably it would have been difficult. I would, as far as I know, for the United States, geostrategically, Taiwan is more important than Ukraine.
We'll see. We'll see. That's an interesting one. Okay, Ben.
Yes, thank you. I see another message. Some EU members are not NATO members. Austria, Sweden, and Finland. Christian wrote that. I think that's a very good point, and that requires some negotiations. I think it also depends on the framework that we would choose. If it's a coalition of the willing, a European Defence Union, then maybe there will be some overlap, that NATO EU members would also have a defense union and the others could choose to stay out of it. Yeah, we'd have to look at that if we get that far.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Anybody else want to comment on?
Oh, just this point, please, Piotr. I don't know if you noticed this evening on the television, they showed that Ukrainian civilians were being distributed with old-fashioned machine guns. And it was a very sad sight that they could, the very thought that they could defeat the Russian army with these weapons. And of course, most of the people would have been untrained in their use. And I know it's always difficult to draw analogies, but I was reminded of the withdrawal from Dunkirk in 1940, when we were unprepared. And it seems again that we're unprepared despite those figures that you showed us at the beginning of your talk.
Indeed, well, yes and no. It is pathetic seeing what they have to do with. We've sent them light weapons when we have, and yes, they have to make do with what they have. However, don't forget that the biggest powers have been defeated by a ragged bunch of people with old-fashioned Kalashnikovs, or before Lee Enfields in Afghanistan. Britain, Soviet Union, and then America. And they were really a ragged bunch, and they really had nothing, and they still managed to defeat. So the fact that Ukrainians have lousy weapons, and not many of them, if they, what they intend to do is, from what I understand, is a guerrilla resistance in which, yes, you get soldiers. When Russian soldiers start going back to the motherland in body bags, Putin doesn't have too many soldiers to waste. Russia has a serious problem with natality, with lack of natality, with lack of, with the low population, particularly young population. Young people try to flee Russia as fast as they can. So he can't waste too many soldiers. Although he would love to, he can't waste soldiers. He can't lose too many soldiers in Ukraine. That will be really a Pyrrhic victory. But yes, you have a good point that we should have given them better weapons. But something we have seen with this during this iteration of Putin's aggression is the fact that Putin has created an agenda. He has created a crisis, and it was our job to stop him attacking the Ukraine. It was our job to do all the running to prevent him from, I'll say, I will attack Ukraine unless you abide by all my demands, which we knew perfectly well that it's absolutely impossible, because he was basically demanding the dismantling of everything that happened since 1991 and NATO in the process. So yeah, he made it our responsibility to obey him, rather than him saying, oh, well, I must propose this, I must propose that. So I do something realistic. So perhaps we should take some initiatives instead of just leaving it all to Putin to run circles around us. And Russians are very good chess players. So it's a fact that we get outmaneuvered again and again. I have here a very good expert, historian Timothy Snyder, on Ukraine, speaking about the history of Ukraine and dismantling Putin's claim that Ukraine is but a small part of Russia, and we must just go back to the motherland and stop pretending that it's a nation or a country, because it doesn't exist. Basically, the gist of it is that Ukraine, or Rus, existed long before today's Russia or Muscovy existed, and Muscovy were actually created under the Mongols. They were collecting taxes for the Mongols. And it's only later, thanks to the conflict between the Cossacks and Poland, the Lithuanian-Poland Commonwealth, that Russia took advantage and grabbed Kyiv, and it became part of the Russian and expanded Russia, because Russia in the meantime had, and then it became known as Russia once Kiev came under the Muscovy power. And then Ukrainian life continued, and the Ukrainian history continued in over the years, although it was also merged into first the Polish Commonwealth than in Poland after World War I, part in Poland and parts in Soviet Union, and then again after World War II under Soviet Union. So it's a very complicated history, but it has a history, it has a literature, and has a culture which exists. You see here there's a long remark from Piotr Naidu. Naidu says the whole problem started when Ukraine wanted to join NATO, EU. Sorry, I don't understand the whole point when EU NATO says we won't send army, but put pressure on Russia via sanctions. But when it came to war on Afghanistan, EU member states had no problem sending their army. Indirectly, does it mean that EU member states stand changes based on who the opponent is? The whole world agrees that Russia is wrong, but they are scared to send an army. I think, yes, it's a very good point. Afghanistan didn't have nuclear weapons, Russia does. So that's a very good reason why nobody dares to attack or to oppose Russia seriously, because, yes, nuclear weapons matter. Okay, something else I came across is, again, by Timothy Snyder. He uses two words which are key in understanding Putin's mentality and Russian behavior. It's maskirovka and provokacja. I don't know if you heard them before. Maskirovka is, we'll come to it. Let me quote from his article, which I think is very good. I wish I could quote all of the 8 pages. Vladimir Putin likes to associate today's Russian Federation with the old Russian Empire. And in one sense, he is right. The Russian Empire was the most repressive state of its era, with the most refined state police, the Okhrana. Russian revolutionaries, the men and women who would establish the Soviet state, were educated by its methods. It did not simply hunt them down. It ensnared them, often without the knowledge, in a complicated dance of incriminating their comrades. It specialized in provocations. It knew how to make its enemies do the work for it. Intelligence work means finding things out. Counterintelligence means making this difficult for others. At the far fringe of counterintelligence are operations designed not just to confuse the word, but to change it. In Russian, maskirovka or provokacja. So in other words, what happens? We've seen maskirovka so much during the last few years. The whole thing that happened, in my opinion, with Trump and Brexit, it's a beautiful case of maskirovka. I see here Teresa on the chat saying, with Putin being rather unpredictable, how likely would a nuclear attack be? Or Russia attacking and destroying nuclear power plant in Ukraine? Russians have taken over Chernobyl power plant already. According to the Ukrainian Environment Service, radioactive levels near the ruins of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant have risen sharply since Thursday evening, from 3,200 nanosieverts per hour to 65,500 nanosieverts per hour. So this is a very worrying aspect. Are the Russians trying to create a nuclear scare in Ukraine, polluting even further Ukraine and poisoning Europe? The problem, it's like with biological weapons. The problem with this kind of weapons is that if the wind changes, the Russians will be as affected as Ukrainians or Europe. So they have to do it only and exclusively when the wind blows north to south, which is never guaranteed. Yes, Anders.
I think any nuclear attack from anybody is very unlikely, and Petra is of course right that it is a difference, as you said also, Piotr, that between Russia and Afghanistan, whether there are nuclear weapons. I mean, the West will not use nuclear weapons against Russia. That is for sure, unless we were really under attack. And Russia don't need nuclear weapons to win in Ukraine. So the question is, can we either with force or more likely with sanctions make it unbearable for Russia to be there and get them out? But there's absolutely no interest in Russia to use nuclear weapons. That would probably also in any case be the beginning of the end and the mutual assured destruction, as we talked about in the 80s. On the nuclear power plants, yes, Chernobyl is very unfortunate case. I don't think it will be radioactive in a very big surroundings of it, but it's not a place where you want anything bad to happen, of course, but I don't think anybody will use it militarily. I think the Russians are there because it's still some kind of power, what do you call it? A power grid, very important key point for the distribution of power, so it's important to get it. But I don't think they will have any attack interest in anything nuclear. And also, since Russia wants to rule there, they don't want their own area to be radioactive. So I don't think there's any big nuclear threat. But lots of other things can go wrong.
Yeah, this is indeed, it's a power hub, it's a electric power hub in Ukraine, is my understanding. But yes, I mean, irradiating for the next 1,000 years sections of Ukraine, or yeah, but perhaps he doesn't intend to stay there. He wants to trash the place, destroy it, and leave, and leave behind a desert, a nuclear desert for the next 1,000 years. That's one way of wreaking revenge. We can't completely discount which suits Putin down to the ground. We cannot completely discount the madman theory. It's some behaviors are not entirely rational. Some behaviors don't make much sense. I have here a very good story on the subject by Tom Nichols, who used to be a criminologist in the good old bad days of the Soviet Union. Now he's a university professor and writer. And like Anders, he says it's very unlikely that Russia would want to start a nuclear conflict, which doesn't mean that it's impossible, considering that somebody could do something stupid anytime. So in war, stupid things happen, like civilian airliners are shot down by mistake. Naidu, sanctions never worked on any country. It only makes people suffer, promotes smuggling crime. Don't know why we are still banking on sanctions. Do we have any other options other than sanctions or sending army? Well, these sanctions are not food sanctions, like the big mistake that was made for a while in Iraq was sanctions which hit the common people, like on food, medical aspects, etc. And that there was turned against the West because Saddam and his coterie were very comfortable, while the common people were suffering. These sanctions this time are exclusively targeted at the oligarchs around Putin and Putin himself. So if oligarchs suffer, I don't think that people will starve in the streets unless Putin decides that I will blame the Western sanctions for you lacking food, but there's absolutely no reason for that. But it's Maskirovka, you never know what he can do next. I have no questions here from Aman Kakar. We never thought that the whole geopolitical graph would take a sheer position because of Russia. If that happened, anything can. From Christian in Stockholm, do we have not the means to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Okay, does anybody want to take this one? Well, the simple reply to this is there's no way to enforce a Russian no-fly zone over Ukraine, because that would mean engaging either EU members or NATO planes over Ukraine, which would mean a direct confrontation with Russia. So, and even if we sent rockets, which would be entirely possible, like Patriots, to attack Russian planes, that would be entirely impossible technically. It's impossible to enforce a no-fly zone. The only way to enforce a no-fly zone is to get Patriots to Ukrainians, who then can shoot down the planes and make life very hard for the Russian pilots, and particularly the helicopters, because helicopters can be shot down quite easily, as we've seen in Afghanistan, by ragged guerrillas who were given shoulder carried rockets by the Americans, and they really caused immense damage. And that's why the Soviet Union had to withdraw from Afghanistan.
Yes, I wrote, thank you. I wrote the United Nations Security Council could enforce this, but Russia is a permanent member, so they have veto rights, and they also happen to be president in the month of February. So that's very unlikely.
That's a good point. And the problem with all the multilateral organizations, they have a certain power to try to convince members to abide, but in the end, if they don't want to abide, they don't. Particularly big members like Russia and with the veto power. Right, anything else?
We have two hands, Jafar and Anders.
Yes, Jafar, go ahead.
Hello. First, please forgive my English. My English not that perfect. I will try to explain as much as possible, and I hope that you will be able to understand me.
Seems very clear so far.
Okay. First, I believe that there is no point to compare the Russians' invasion of Ukraine with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, because there is a very important point that the technology now is very advanced than what was in 1989. Stinger rockets can do nothing in Ukraine now, completely nothing, because Sukhoi 35 can make can attack from about 5 kilometers high. So Stinger can do nothing. This is first point you were talking about. About the question why Europe, while Europe has a very big population, we have in Europe now 500 millions, while Russia have about 150 millions only. And while Europe has a very high technology and everything, let's take a very simple example with Germany. Germany can make the best tanks in the world, the tanks called Leopard. And one tank of Leopard can fight at least 5 tanks of T-99, Russian tanks. So Europe in technology and in economic and in population is better than Russia. So how Russia can feel so strong against Europe? It's really a very big question. And in fact, I didn't decide to speak today, but because your question first was this, and I have been thinking about it for last 3 days. And the answer in my mind is that because Russia knows that, unfortunately, that European countries are divided. This is the main point. If Germany and France and England and Italy, only these 4 countries really works together, Russia would never dare to attack Ukraine. But because they knew that European peoples are divided, then they feel very strong and they attack Ukraine. And honestly, if we can learn anything from the last 3 days, that Russians are very weak. In 3 days, they use the Belarus land, they use Black Sea and their border, of course. And until now, after 3 days, they were not able to reach Kiev. For me, it's a very big field for Russians, because Russia has a very big army comparing with Ukraine. Ukraine is a very weak country. You cannot compare it even with Poland, by military, I mean. So I don't understand why Europe should be afraid of Russia. I think if Germany itself put a real plan against Russia and spend a real money in the high technology and military industry, Germany itself can stop Russia. So there is no real reason to Europe to be scared of Russia. For me, I don't know.
Thank you, Jaffa. Well, yeah, you make some very interesting points. First of all, the European division is real, and it's a real problem.
Yeah.
We would be more powerful than the US, potentially, in terms of population, at least. We have more population than the US. And the GDP could soon catch up or overtake it. We have extraordinary potential, but we don't use it because we are so divided. As to Germany taking on Russia on its own, there's a problem there. First of all, I would be very worried about the memory of World War II, when the Nazis attacked Russia. And
it's an important point. Sorry to say something. We shouldn't always be scared about the memory of the World War II. Germany has the right to protect itself and to protect Europe. The situation now has been changed. We are not talking about the same situation when there was Nazis party on power in Germany. Now we are talking about a democratic government in Germany. So I cannot compare this two governments.
We cannot compare it, but the Russians will never hesitate to use it. One of the great arguments, entirely false, but one of the great arguments Putin is using to attack Ukraine is the Nazis. It's some supposed Nazis in power in Ukraine, which is entirely false, but he's using it as an excuse. So never underestimate his capability.
He used it because he thinks that Russian people always, when you use this word Nazis, he can remind Russian people about the World War. He used it for his country, not for Europe.
Yeah, but the biggest group, the biggest group of Nazis in the world at the moment is in Russia, and in fact, the great heroes Dugin and Ilyin, from what I remember, are fascists and Nazis.
He uses the same claims of Hitler. Hitler, when invade the Czech Republic, he said that he moved there to protect German speakers in Czech Republic.
Absolutely.
So it's exactly what Putin is doing now with the Russian speakers in Ukraine. It's the same title exactly.
He's copying it exactly.
And he used also historical title, like he wants Kiev because Kiev was the first Rus principle in the history.
Kiev and Rus, yes.
Yeah, he used this title. So he has also a province of Russia called Kaliningrad between Poland and Lithuania.
Yeah.
Kaliningrad was also the place where all of the German kings was thrown between the, I think between the 14th century until 17th century. So if we will start to speak about history, then Germany should arrive until now, it will be very close to St. Petersburg, if we will talk about history.
Yes.
So everyone can speak about history if you will start to speak about this.
Well, you can bend it any way you want. You can rewrite it. Anyway, Anders, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, just on the sanctions, because you said it was about oligarchs. I think that made sense, and the people of Kremlin, when the problem was human rights violations and other things where you want to put pressure on the people who decide. I think now we need sanctions that really hurt also the civilian population. We need to strangle the Russian economy. And that is because the will to fight in Ukraine depends on how many comes back in body bags, as you said, Piotr, but also about how is life for the Russian. Because if the Russian population tires of this, then there is a hope that they will retreat. And that can also be because you cannot use the SWIFT system, for instance, in Russia, because you cannot make payment, because the Russian economy could collapse. So I think this time, if sanctions need to have any meaning, they will need to try to hurt the general population too. And that brings back a question, I think it wasn't mentioned, but Lorna asked about whether there could be a coup in Russia. I'm not sure what exactly it meant with coup here, whether it would be the armed forces, but Putin has some public support, but I think it's shallow. So I think it really matters if we can turn the Russian population against him, also by making life unbearable in Russia. And I think that is the purpose with sanctions this time around.
Well, we had this kind of discussion actually when we spoke with our Russian Natalia and Dmitry, and we did the question of a coup came up, and the point is that young people seem to be against Putin, and it's the old generation that is in favor of Putin. The question is, how do you target your sanctions to hurt Putin's old supporters and not the young supporters who are pro-Western and are desperate to get out and to have a life and who have no hope at the moment? Ben.
Thank you. I'm just raising my hand because I see a few comments. The power is hence given to wrong hands by United Nations Security Council, by Amman. The ones who should ensure the security and protection are the ones invading it. UN is like League of Nations today. And then Teresa said, our military is ... rusty, Germany. Christian wrote, if you cannot enforce no-fly zones, should we not blockade the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea? So those were the comments.
Okay. That's a very good question. Yeah. Well, again, a blockade would be considered hostile act. And in fact, NATO said that cyber attacks direct cyber attacks on NATO members by Russia would be considered acts of war. But this is a pretty shady area. So yes, a blockade could be considered an act and could start World War III, or at least would give Putin a chance to threaten it. So very dodgy question, and I can't see anybody willing to enforce it. But yeah, that's a very good point. We should try at least something. Anything else? Neil is leaving. Bye, Neil. Okay, well, I think we've had a good we've looked at a few elements of what's going on in Ukraine, and above all, we're trying to understand why and what we can do about it in this small group. And I hope that we all have exchanging ideas and exchanging what we know. We may know a bit more about, understand a bit better what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia. And so unless we have final questions, we will say goodnight to all. Thanks for participating. And we have another meeting, same time, 2030 CT on Monday. This is on disinformation, which is very topical. We touched on some aspects of disinformation, misinformation today. We'll discuss it more in depth on Monday. So thank you and good night to all.
Thank you, Piotr.
Thank you.
Participants.